Hello and welcome to Wide Angle. We have with us today Dr. Christine Fair. She's a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. and one of the foremost scholars on South Asian security and terrorism in this part of the world as well. Christine, thanks very much for being on our little show for The Wire.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start by this new book that you've released, which is called In Their Own Words. Oxford University Press has brought it out, and it's basically the biographies of some of the shaheeds of the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. What prompted you to go into these stories? How did you go about getting this research? Because it's interesting.
So a little bit about the book.
Yeah.
So it's different from some of the other books on LET. Like my friend Stephen Tankel has done a really great book. Sushant Shireen has also done a very good book. The books that are out there so far, they focus upon what the organization does and how and where. Mm-hmm. So I want to focus upon what they say about themselves. How do they represent what they do? Not necessarily to Indians or the rest of the world, but rather to Pakistanis. I think one of the things that people don't appreciate is that the Lashkar has an important domestic role that it plays within Pakistan. So people ask, why does the ISI dedicate so much resources to the Jamaat al-Dawa, which is the organization that the name that it uses in Pakistan. And the reason is that it does a lot of political work for the deep state itself. And this becomes really only apparent when you begin reading their literature. So I've been collecting their stuff since I was a student in Pakistan in the 1990s. So I literally just have a mountain of this stuff.
And you say in your introduction actually that after a point they realized what you were doing and they cut off access from some of that literature.
Well, so what happened is that the Pakistanis became aware that people were interested in reading this stuff.
Right.
And it became much more difficult to get. And they stopped putting like Shaheed biographies on the web. And then also they keep getting deplatformed. So it's difficult to continue going to their website. Even Jamaat al-Dawa, FIF, they continue to get deplatformed. So I was having initially difficulties in getting some of the books that I knew they had published. Mm-hmm. Then I learned from my old Urdu Ustad at the University of Chicago that the Library of Congress buys Lashkar books. And therefore, they're available in libraries across the United States. So then what I was able to do was just go through interlibrary loan and get these books.
Is there a profile, like a psychological profile of the kind of person who chooses to become a shaheed for Lashkar? I mean, in India's words, that's a terrorist.
So I view them differently. I don't use the word radical in my book at all, because I don't view them that way. When we call someone radical, we stop seeing them as a rational actor, right? And so I view these people essentially as combatants. And so the part of the book, and the whole book isn't on the shaheeds, the whole book is really sort of insights from this curated sample. There is a sequel coming out to this book, which I'm doing with my collaborator, which is the English translations of the texts that I use in this book. So going back to this organization, I don't view these guys as radical. I view them as combatants. And so I approach this from the point of view of combatant motivation. And there's a lot of literature in different battle spaces about what motivates someone to fight. And so this is kind of how I'm approaching it. So the part that's in the book is a subsection of a much larger project that I have. I've got like 1,000 plus or minus or so of these so-called shaheed biographies. So what's in the book is a 10% random sample. Mm-hmm. The next phase of this project is I'm looking at all 1,000 of these things. So this is just sort of an amuse-bouche of what we get from these things. And what I'd already done was coded up with collaborators certain aspects of these data across all of them. So for example, we know where most of these guys come from, and I've got maps in the book. And it's not surprising that the majority of these guys are coming out of the Punjab. Yeah. There's something like 10 districts that produce an overwhelming majority of Lashkar fighters, right? So we've already...
Why is that?
So I think there's a couple of things. The majority of the Pakistani army is all co-located in the Punjab, right? You only have corps in Quetta, Karachi, and Peshawar. Right. Everything else is either in Pindi, which is basically a Punjabi city in the Punjab. So you've got that. And then also, Punjab was the most affected part of partition.
Of partition, right.
And you see this, this comes across in their literature quite a bit, is what happened during partition, how partition was so unfair, the communal violence. And of course, it's a very one-sided story. Like they obviously don't talk about Muslim predations on Hindus and Sikhs. They only talk about, and they don't even mention really Sikh predations on Muslims. They really characterize partition as a Muslim-Hindu phenomenon. And of course, we know that really wasn't true. Sikhs and Hindus on one side and Muslims on the other. So partition looms very large in their imagination. It's also not a surprise that some of the most intense LET producing districts are right on the border. Mm-hmm. And then there's also a logistical issue, I think. Is it because of this proximity, they feel like a part of India. I think there's something psychological about these districts that are producing these Lashkars. But so I think it's a combination of this legacy of partition coupled with the footprint of the Pakistan army. Mm-hmm. So I think that probably explains most of it.
And the individual biographies that you studied and you surveyed, apart from these commonalities of the district, the geographies, the histories, what about their own individual characters? Were there any common denominators over there?
So the ones that we've gone through, and as I said, the larger project is going to involve, translating
1,000,
all 1,000 of them, as opposed to just like pulling out details. There are some things. There is no single profile. I think part of it is because at different times we have different narrators. Sometimes it's the mother talking about her son. Sometimes it's the fighter talking about himself. Sometimes it's his battle buddy or his commander. So when you have these different authorial voices, they tend to dilate upon different kinds of things. But there are some general themes. So you do get the sense in many of the Shaheed biographies that we've reviewed, some of these guys are just bored, right? And this resonates with me back when I was working on U.S. Army recruitment. Mm-hmm. A lot of these guys, they just joined the Army because they live in a crappy town and they want some adventure. And what they're doing, working as a mechanic, is not really fulfilling. I mean, and in some sense, that was the story of my brothers. They went to Iraq. When they came back from Iraq, their ordinary jobs were not remotely interesting to them. They became full-time Army, right? So I see in a lot of these, they're very dissatisfied with the mundaneness of their life. That's one thing. Then there's another group of people, and they're looking for adventure, like any other person that would join a military organization. Then you have these folks who they kind of become more aware of themselves as Muslims when they're in school, when they're in college. Like they'll meet someone from Lashkar who's very charismatic and points out to them, like, look, your parents are living very luxuriously. They're living off of bank interest. By living a simpler life, you could be a better Muslim. Mm-hmm. And they go home and they start proselytizing this. Mm-hmm. And then as they get closer to the organization, they then go off for different levels of training. Mm-hmm. So just about everyone can do the basic training, the Dore-Am. And that's basically ideological. Maybe you'll see a weapon, maybe you'll get to pet a weapon, but that's really about being a better Muslim as Lashkar sees it.
So coming from the perspective of an Indian reader looking at this, anecdotally, many Indians have pieced this alliance between the Pakistani state and the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, the JUD, together. So this is a confirmation in many ways of what the security establishment, certainly in India, has been saying. Obviously, as you are more than aware, the leader of the JUD, Hafiz Saeed, is somebody on India's most wanted list.
Yeah.
The United States now has a bounty out on his name as well. He's considered to be the mastermind of one of the worst terror attacks on Indian soil, the Mumbai attacks of 26/11, 2008. And yet there seems to be, so it's interesting that you say that this book is also for the domestic consumption of Pakistan, because they need to understand the kind of violence that perhaps these people are capable of just for the sake of adventure.
So there are a couple interesting things about that. Most Pakistanis, it's funny, Pakistanis live in a chronic state of denial, right? Because on the one hand, this organization boasts about what it does. It has these Shaheed biographies where they literally talk about how many kuffars they killed, right? On the other hand, they want to say, no, Jamaat al-Dawa it's an organization that does charity, and they do charity, right? So Pakistanis are very schizophrenic. And I think one of the things that's happened is that there's been a very effective rebranding of the organization going back to 2002. Pakistanis think that Lashkar and JUD are a totally different thing. Now, whether they truly believe that, but I've got polling data that suggests that it does. I asked them, what do you think these organizations do? And they list very different things. So part of JUD's function in Pakistani society is to, the first thing to understand is that they are anti-sectarian. What does that mean? They don't believe in killing Shia. They don't believe in killing Barelvis. They reject takfiri. So they are vigorously at odds with the Islamic State and most of the Deobandi groups, because mostly Deobandis that are killing Pakistanis. Even within Pakistan, they don't advocate killing Hindus. Right? It's really quite remarkable. They believe that within Pakistan, Hindus should be converted. So what the organization advocates within the state is very different for what it advocates outside of the state, right? So and going back to the bounty on Hafiz Saeed that the Americans have leveraged or have placed, there's misunderstanding around that. It's not literally a bounty for his head. What it is a bounty for evidence that could lead to a successful prosecution, right? Because we have a lot of intelligence, but intelligence can't be used in a court of law, right? Because we can't do it. If you present intelligence, you reveal your sources. Yeah. But here's the funny thing about this book. At various times, I've reached out to the Department of Justice. Here's a couple of things that I think is really curious. One of the things, and this is coming out in full translation in the sequel to this book that OUP is also publishing. It's called Hum Kyun Jihad Kar Rahe Hain. Why are we waging jihad? It's pretty clear what they're talking about. And the whole book is about why we wage militarized jihad. In fact, they rubbish any other kind of jihad, right? The whole thing is arguing that every Muslim in Pakistan must fight an external jihad. They're very clear that there's no legitimate domestic jihad. The only legitimate form of violence happens outside of the state, right? So then you understand why this organization is so important to the state. But Hafiz Saeed endorses this book. It's under the Jamaat al-Dawa imprimatur, and it's got the Lashkar flag. There's nothing. What more evidence do you need that this organization does this than this book? Also, in some of the biographies, we have very clear evidence, because the bios themselves say it. When someone joins the Indian Army or the U.S. Army, you don't have to try to get deployed. Your country goes to war, you go to theater, right? It doesn't happen with Lashkar, because most of the people that they train, they send back home to do tabligh and dawah for Jamaat al-Dawa, right? So a very small number of people will ever get deployed. And we see in their biographies that they're constantly having to work the bureaucracy to get more training. Once they've done all the training, working the bureaucracy to get deployed. And we actually have in the biographies, Hafiz Saeed himself, in the biographies, is sending someone on a mission, right? So here we have a publication published by his own organization in which he himself is sending someone off to kill Indians.
So in a sense, you're asking, what more evidence do you need?
What more evidence do you need? We also have cases where Lakvi, is also doing this.
So what more evidence do they need?
Exactly. And I said, look, I'm just giving it to you as an American. And so so once I began interacting with the Department of Justice, I began to think, I don't think you really want evidence because I'm sitting on a pile of it. Right?
So if they don't want evidence, then that opens up a whole different conversation entirely.
Exactly. Because it's not, I find it hard to believe that there's not evidence because I've been sitting on it, right? And I've offered it to them and I don't want the bounty.
But how does this tie in then? I mean, we'll get back to the dynamics of South Asia in a bit, but how does this then tie in with the kind of statements that have come out of DC, not just under this administration, but including in the Obama administration in the past about,
And George W. Bush.
Yes, this is the most dangerous place in the world.
Clinton said that.
Bill Clinton said that. Hillary Clinton talked about snakes in their backyard. We've seen a South Asia policy now in 2017 that is basically sort of talked about how Pakistan is no longer going to be the beneficiary and the recipient of U.S. largesse in its fight against terror as well. So, you have, in a sense, the right noises coming from Washington, but that doesn't translate into action. And sitting here in Delhi, it just seems like, well, they'll fall back into the same pattern of behavior, even though they're making these statements. I could be wrong.
So the good news is that I think the Trump administration means it when it says we're not giving them more money, right? I mean, how the Trump administration came about this decision is another issue, right? There's no evidence that it was a considered decision. Trump basically woke up, read on a Monday, Friday morning's New York Times at 0:30, mad as heck, and he tweets this, right? And I know it wasn't a considered policy decision because I then watched different parts of the administration run around and figure out what they were going to do about it. The first thing that they announced was no more FMF. Well, the FMF was a very small portion of monies. But then as the policy coalesced, meant no money at all. So I do believe that they're serious about this. And this is, I think, one of the areas where I think the Trump administration has actually stumbled into something correct. But I think that it's not enough to cut them off from money. And I've been saying this for years. I mean, I've been saying you've got to cut them off and you have to sanction them. You have to sanction them. And most importantly, you have to cut them off from the IMF.
But do you think the U.S. is ready to impose sanctions against Pakistan?
Well, so for me, we have the same question, right? And I think the interesting thing about the Trump administration is that it's a little bit like a box of chocolates. You never know what exactly you're going to get.
Okay.
Right? So he could decide on a whim that Pakistan is going to use IMF money to do something that irks him, and he's going to demand that the U.S. withdraw support from the IMF. I would welcome that because I think the Pakistanis would be scrambling to make up the loss of American. The Americans don't have a dominant share of IMF votes. We have the largest number of shares. And if the United States doesn't withdraw support for the IMF, and this next IMF tranche goes through, the IMF is going to be subsidizing CPEC loan repayments, right? So in other words, we're just basically letting the Pakistanis continue to write checks it can't back to the Chinese. So I think it's possible.
For a road that cuts through Kashmir?
I think it's possible that we're going to cut off IMF funding. What do I mean by possible? Not because it's necessary, but I know there are enough people who share my opinion on this. And it's kind of ironic because I'm a huge critic of this
administration, that's right.
But I do know enough people and enough places who have over the years, because on foreign policy issues, I'm more of a traditional Republican than I am anything else, which is the irony, right? On social policy, I'm very liberal, but I'm much more of a hard national security person. And some of my Republican friends happen to share my views, and they happen to be in government. So I would not write off a possibility of an IMF cutoff. Am I a betting person? Am I going to say it's 60-40? No. I think it's 30.
That's not possible in this administration. To be a betting person.
You cannot be a betting person. But I think in previous administrations, the odds were 0 of an IMF cutoff.
So the odds are higher now.
I think the odds could be as high as 30%. I mean, I'm actually optimistic when we get an assistant secretary of state sworn in, that there's going to be support for cutting off IMF. And the very fact that Pompeo himself raised this issue, and he said, we want more transparency on CPEC to make sure we're not subsidizing your loans. And the Pakistani said, no way, we're not giving you any transparency. So I think for the first time ever, this might be a possibility. That will be huge.
So let me just bring it back to the region a little bit, and in terms of the security scenario, in this way that Washington has been operating in the last couple of years, there's been consistency on one front. When he won the election, when he was sworn into office, Donald Trump was very clear about pulling troops out of Afghanistan. And he's pulled back 7,000 now, and he says by the end of this year, there'll be no American troops left in Afghanistan. That opens up a huge security concern for India, for sure, because we've seen, the Lashkar or the Pakistani ISI use proxies in Afghanistan to target Indian missions. And what could that then mean coming forward here? So.
No, you're right. Now, to be fair, I don't think that the tweet state and the deep state are on the same page.
Okay.
Right. So just like with the ISIS reversal of his decision, I think he's going to get a lot of pushback on this Afghan policy. The military doesn't support this, right? The military, I think militaries all over the world are like this. They really think in terms of sunk costs. From the military, there have been too many lives lost and too much money sunk for them to just walk away. So I don't think the military supports this. So I think, as with the Syria policy, we're going to have to see how well does the tweet state and the deep state align. And if the person I know to be this in line to be confirmed for the Assistant Secretary of State, if he in fact is confirmed, I'm pretty certain he doesn't support that policy. But let's pretend that we know that all troops are going to be gone, and I think obviously that's going to happen sooner than later. But like President Karzai said, I don't think we are going to break our commitments under the bilateral security cooperation agreement. But let's pretend that the troops are gone. My concerns are a little bit larger than that. The Afghan state can't pay for itself, right? So leave aside how many troops come or go, who's going to pay those bills? And that's the lesson of Najibullah, right? Najibullah hung on as long as he could pay his security forces, right? He didn't die immediately, right? He hung on until the last Russian check was cashed, and then he fell very quickly. And Pakistan threw everything at Najibullah. So I have been very concerned that we have all been focusing about how many troops and what are they going to do. We have not had a discussion about economic viability of the Afghan state itself, right? And other things that the Trump administration has done has been very injurious to that. So Ghani, he's an economist, he understands that the Afghan state needs to be sustainable.
Right.
And over the years, Afghanistan has been able to increase its connectivity to other countries in the region. Afghanistan needs a logistical lifeline other than Pakistan, right? Pakistan only uses access to its ports to extract obeyance from Afghanistan. So unfortunately, Trump's misguided policy on Iran, coupled with his not so terribly terrific instincts on Afghanistan, leave me very worried about what's going to happen to Afghanistan financially. Afghanistan needs access to that Chabahar port. And so I was happy that India got a waiver, but India is only developing one of those berths. Right. And it's also getting a waiver to develop that railway station, because there's a provision in the snapback sanctions that if you're doing certain activities for Afghan rehabilitation, that you can get a waiver.
Then you get a waiver, right. So the Zahedan railway line is one of those, right?
Exactly. So I'm glad that happened. But is that going to be enough for Chabahar to become a truly viable port that will be economically viably competitive with, say, Karachi. Gwadar is a joke. It's not even considered Gwadar. It's a complete joke. But Afghanistan needs access to Chabahar, and Chabahar has to be a thriving port for that to be useful.
Apart from the economic security, which is, I think, also the crux of stability ultimately in the country, in terms of just security, what happens? I mean, there's hands being held out towards the Taliban, different factions. What kind of arrangement should there be? Should they be in part of a power sharing arrangement at all or not? Because then that poses up a different level of security concern, I think, for India.
So I think you're absolutely right, and I think India's equities here are really important, and I think India will probably be one of the countries that's really going to suffer from this. The Indians, long before 9/11, right? Indians knew that what happened in Afghanistan mattered to India, right? And I mean, the entire birth of Jaish-e-Mohammed happened because of the hijacking of the Indian Airways flight, from Kathmandu.
Right.
And India has always known that the groups that have been attacking India in Kashmir were groups that had trained in Afghanistan, right? So India has always understood this, which is why India was always working with the Northern Alliance, trying to do what it could to limit the ability of the Deobandi groups like the Taliban to expand territory. So I don't think India should be comforted by this. Okay. I don't think there's any way you get to a place where anyone in the Trump administration can say to India, don't be worried about this, right? Because the attrition of the Afghan National Security Forces, they are hemorrhaging people every day, right? They cannot fill those boots fast enough. And so when you couple that with economic insecurity, how is he going to pay his troops, right? What happens? I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Afghan state to project power to places like Kunar, right? Kunar is basically a black hole, right? And Kunar is where Lashkar-e-Tayyaba has long operated, among others.
So this is a serious security concern as far as India is concerned. And
serious concern.
We also heard when President Trump was announcing this, he talked about countries that build libraries in Afghanistan. That's a comment that's been not taken too well in Delhi for obvious reasons. But can we expect more of that kind of commentary from Washington? Because that would, again, put a strain on all the alliances and all the conversations in the region.
As I said, there's the tweet state and there's the deep state. And as you know, I have gotten into considerable trouble for criticizing the tweet state. So I'm going to try to demur a little bit.
Okay.
But I think you should expect such things. This is not an individual who reads. This is not an individual who likes getting his daily briefings. I mean, he thinks daily briefings are like, broccoli or something. I'd like to think that he confused this mystical library with the Parliament building. I don't even know where this idea of a library came from.
Right.
But I suspect it was confusing it with the Parliament, right?
Okay, I guess.
It's a building and where people go and do stuff. But he's not someone who knows history. He's not someone who seems to care about history. He seems to get ideas in his head from mysterious places and they come out of his mouth, right? So, for example, his comments about the Soviet war, which in fairness wasn't the dumbest thing he's ever said.
Okay.
There were look, we can debate how relevant the Afghan war was to breaking up the Soviet Union, but we do know that it contributed to their economic demise. It probably would have broken up without the Afghan war, right? What I was actually more appalled by was the reaction on all sides to jump on top of this. And my view has always been the biggest mistake was the Americans supporting the Mujahideen, right? This was Pakistan's policy. They began it in 1974. What's the worst that would have happened? Some Afghans would have become literate. I mean, and I don't mean that flippantly. The Soviet Union could not have held on to Afghanistan. We now know historically that it was on the verge of collapsing. And had the Americans not contributed so much to this effort, fewer Afghans would have died and Al-Qaeda would not have arisen.
And there would have been a different history over the last 3 decades or 4 decades that we've written so far.
Absolutely.
So we're running out of time, so I'm going to end it over there. But as you said, the tweet state and the deep state don't always speak the same language, or more often than not, don't speak the same language. And one would have to see which way, which wins out, basically, at the end of this year, right? All right, Christine Fair, thanks so much for giving us some of your time. Thanks a lot.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.